Exeunt reduction. One cast of characters. 7.1. The Great Mob War. 11.2. The Collapse of the Old Regime. 46.3. Trader's Paradise. 77.4. Selling the Country for Vouchers. 110.5. The Listayev Murder. 144.6. Privatizing the Profits of Aeroflot. 177. The Race for Oil. 188.8. The Black Treasury of the Yeltsin Campaign. 212.9. Oligarchy. 248.10. Vladimir Putin takes power. 284 Epilogue. 318 Appendix I. Boris Berezovsky appeals to the President. 327 Appendix II. The Yeltsin campaign covers up. 337 Appendix III. Berezovsky's Empire. 345 List of sources. 346 Notes. 361 Index. 391. 7. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-in tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. W. B. Yeats. Preface. Whenever I met important Russians over the past decade, I always taped our conversations. Unless otherwise noted, the assertions made in this book are based on tape-recorded interviews with the businessmen and politicians who ruled Russia in the 1990s. In Russia the truth has long been fluid, and I found that my interlocutors often made use of this fluidity. Usually, they were telling not so much the whole truth as only part of it. The challenge of this book has been to piece together the fragments of truth, weigh them against one another, and arrive at a complete picture. I found that the task became easier with time. The more a person knows, the less likely he is to be lied to. In telling this story, I have tried to be conservative in asserting what I believe to be true. Throughout, my sources are noted to allow the reader to judge for himself their solidity or lack thereof. I have left a trail of my research, so that the reader may be in a position to decide for himself what to believe and what not to believe. So much of contemporary Russian history is conveyed by word of mouth, asserted by people who were there. Often, these people report things they do not know. That is the minefield any journalist must navigate. But many agreements in Russian business and politics. 11. 12 Godfather of the Kremlin. Are made with a handshake. Seldom is anything written down. Often these contracts are much more solid than the written ones, so a determined analyst of contemporary Russia must not be discouraged by the lack of Western-style documentation. Nevertheless, many of the key elements of this story are documented from publicly available annual reports, registration documents, or investment banking analyses, to more closely held copies of contracts and boardroom minutes. I have also used a number of government documents, both classified and unclassified, to clarify the nature of the relationships among the various protagonists of this story. In many respects, Russia under Yeltsin was still a police state as telephones were tapped, confidential documents were exposed, individuals were subject to intense surveillance, albeit a police state that had been privatized. Huge numbers of specialists from the old Soviet security and law enforcement apparatus took jobs in the private sector. Every large financial-industrial group created its own mini-KGB, usually known as the Analytical Department, staffed with people who were good at collecting information, eavesdropping on rivals, and stealing documents. The intelligence dossiers compiled by these analytical departments invariably took the form of the standard briefs that went into the files of the old Soviet security services. Often, the data were inaccurate, but I occasionally found these reports to be a useful source of background information. Some of the information collected by these private intelligence agencies would later be confirmed by public events or by law enforcement agencies. Among my sources were former members of the Presidential Security Service. Before it was disbanded in 1996, the SBP was one of the most powerful institutions in Russia. It employed approximately 500 specialists from commandos trained in special operations, to intelligence analysts equipped with the latest surveillance technology. The SBP's mission was not only to guard Yeltsin, but also to investigate allegations of corruption or espionage among high government officials. During the Yeltsin era, there was a great deal of leakage from the law enforcement agencies. There seemed to be no clear policy about what information could be released to the public. Many individuals took it upon themselves to share documents with me. For the most part, these individuals were frustrated by the inability of the Russian legal system to bring criminals to justice. They believed that when the court system does not work, glasnost public exposure can provide some kind of tonic against the epidemic of crime. Many of the people who talked to me about the events described in this book spoke only on the basis of a prior agreement that they would not be quoted. These interviews served only as background information. If I have included the events these anonymous sources described to me, I have done so only if I have confirmation from an on-the-record source. In the rare cases when an anonymous source was the only one for the material, I have cited him in the notes. The most important of these is referred to in the notes as a ROP source. This man is a former high-ranking officer in the Moscow ROP. I have confidence in the reliability of his information, because he has been in a position to know the events he describes. Moreover, I have relied on this man since 1993 and, over the years, he has provided me with a lot of information that would later be proved correct by events. Individuals he identified as gangster bosses, for instance, would later be revealed as such by their involvement in shootouts or by their arrest and conviction by Western law enforcement agencies. I have tried to avoid relying on newspaper sources as the foundation for my narrative. The times when I do cite newspaper sources, I do so only for their role as a daily chronicle of public events or for their verbatim interviews with one of my protagonists. Most of the times when I felt I had to use an interview conducted by another journalist, the latter did not share the tape of his conversation with the subject. However, I still believe these printed interviews to be accurate, both because of the good reputation of the newspapers in which they appeared and because the interview subjects themselves would often return to the same newspaper to grant another interview months or years later. I am assuming, in other words, that if a person was misquoted in a given newspaper he would not go back to that publication again. The best sources for this book are the protagonists themselves. In writing this documentary and oral history of the Yeltsin era, I am sure that I have missed a lot. There will almost certainly be books that expose the lives of my protagonists in more revealing detail. But I had the opportunity to catch these men in the early 1990s, in their age of innocence, when they spoke frankly, often boasting of their criminal exploits and, equally frankly, lied. Godfather of the Kremlin. Introduction. In February 1997, Forbes magazine was sued by a man named Boris Berezovsky. This individual had risen out of nowhere to become the richest businessman in Russia and one of the most powerful individuals in the country. I had profiled Berezovsky in a December 1996 article entitled Godfather of the Kremlin. He hired English litigators and sued for libel in London High Court. As of the publication of this book, the litigation is still pending. Forbes was not intimidated by the prospect of a libel trial, and I continued to publish articles on Berezovsky. 1. I noticed that his shadow loomed over many of the great events that have shaken Russia throughout the past decade. I started going through the tapes of my earlier interviews with the robber barons of Russia's new era, men whose careers intersected with Berezovsky's, commodities traders who briefly controlled the Russian economy, factory bosses lording over sprawling industrial empires, young bankers, unscrupulous and tough, who made fortunes from their political connections. These men were great when Berezovsky was small. They were in the spotlight while he was backstage, waiting. Many of Russia's business magnates had inherited their wealth from the old Soviet Union. They were authorized millionaires, but Berezovsky built his empire from scratch. While many individuals contributed to Russia's decline in the 1990s, Berezovsky exemplified the spirit of the era. No man was as versatile in negotiating the rapidly changing situation. With each new twist in Russia's agonizing transition to a market economy, Berezovsky reinvented himself to profit from the change. And when he turned to politics, he dominated his peers. Having privatized vast stretches of Ru-5 Cyan industry, Berezovsky privatized the state. Russia's decline from a global superpower to an impoverished country is one of the most curious events in history. The collapse occurred during a period of peace and took only a few years. In its rapidity and magnitude, the collapse is unprecedented in world history. When Mikhail Gorbachev launched perestroika and when Boris Yeltsin emerged as Russia's first democratic president, I expected that Russia would get the same burst of energy that had invigorated China after the reforms of Deng Xiaoping. I expected the same kind of national economic revival that had followed the decollectivization of agriculture by Russian Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin almost a century earlier. But soon I understood that Russia was falling apart. When Yeltsin's government freed prices, it unleashed hyperinflation, which instantly impoverished the majority of the population. The introduction of the free market did not produce a more efficient economy, it produced relentless economic decline. Privatization enriched only a small number of insiders. The country was being looted and destroyed by the new property owners. How could everything have gone so wrong? All trails seemed to lead to Russian organized crime. I wrote articles about the grotesque lifestyles and lurid violence of the new gangsters. While investigating the Russian mafia, I was always given the same advice: if you want to write about Russian organized crime, don't focus on the colorful mafia chiefs, but on the government. Russia was a gangster state, I was told, and its political system nothing more than a government of organized crime. The FBI definition of organized crime is a continuing criminal conspiracy, fed by fear and corruption, and motivated by greed. The definition includes the following: they commit or threaten to commit acts of violence or intimidation. Their activities are methodical, systematic, disciplined, or secret. They insulate their leadership from direct involvement in illegal activities through an intricate bureaucracy. They attempt to influence government, politics, and commerce through corruption, graft, and legitimate means. And their primary goal is economic gain. Not only from patently illegal enterprises, but also from such activities as laundering illegal money and investment in legitimate businesses. 2. A clear history of criminal activity during the Yeltsin era is difficult to establish. Almost none of the most famous murders have been solved. Even past convictions have been difficult to identify. A major problem for law enforcement agencies was the ability of well-connected ex-convicts to pull their files, thus erasing any trace of past crimes. The Russian legal code was full of ambiguities and loopholes. Many financial operations that in the West would be classified as crimes are not necessarily crimes in Russia. 3 Russian gangsters could ignore the police because they had protection at the top. The typical gangster organization in Russia began with street corner thugs who extorted money from local businesses. These men answered to a citywide criminal organization. This organization, in turn, was subject to mob bosses functioning on the national level. At each level, the gangsters had allies in the government, beginning with the local police precinct or tax inspectorate, proceeding to the mayors and governors, and ending with the entourage of President Yeltsin himself. Typically, any successful Russian businessman had to deal with these 2 chains of command. The Russian power structure was a 3-sided pyramid, composed of gangsters, businessmen, and government officials. Behind every historic process stand specific individuals. I wanted to know who Russia's real bosses were. Who had brought the country to such a state? Who stood at the top of the pyramid? In the autumn of 1996, I began looking into the affairs of Boris Berezovsky. No man stood closer to all 3 authorities at once: crime, commerce, and government. No man profited more from Russia's slide into the abyss. It was on a trip to the Volga town of Togliatti, 700 miles east of Moscow, home of Russia's largest auto company, Avtovaz, that I first learned of him. I was writing an article on the Russian car industry and had heard that Avtovaz was somehow connected with an entrepreneur named Berezovsky. When I asked Avtovaz president Alexei Nikolaev about Berezovsky's holding company Ilgavaz, the auto executive and his aides exchanged worried glances. I saw a flash of fear in the faces across the table. "We no longer have direct links with Ilgavaz," he mumbled. "They have some sort of business of their own over there." For who was this businessman whose very name brought on silence? As I looked into Berezovsky's meteoric career, I discovered a history replete with bankrupt companies and violent deaths. The scale of destruction was extraordinary, even by contemporary Russian standards. He had soaked the cash out of the big companies he dealt with, leaving them effectively bankrupt, kept afloat only by lavish government subsidies. He seemed to gravitate to the most violent corners of Russia: the car dealership business, the aluminum industry, the ransoming of hostages in Chechnya. Many of his business ventures, from the takeover of Russian public television to that of the Omsk oil refinery, were marred by the assassination or accidental death of key players. Shortly after his interference in the management of the National Sports Fund, there was an attempt to assassinate the charity's ex-president. There is no evidence that Berezovsky was responsible for any of these deaths, although he was briefly under suspicion for the Yeltsin-era's most famous assassination, in 1995. He has never been charged with any crime relating to these events. I met Berezovsky in the autumn of 1996 in Moscow. It was immediately evident that he was highly intelligent. He holds a Ph.D. in mathematics. He spoke nervously, articulately, waving a hand scarred from an assassination attempt in the early years of the Yeltsin regime. He was unapologetic about the violence of the Russian business world and quickly took the moral high ground. The Western press portrays Russia unfairly, he declared. Russian business is not synonymous with the mafia. I asked why the government was incapable of bringing the mobsters to justice. Because in the government there are many people who are criminals themselves, he replied. They are not interested in having these crimes solved. 5. A month later Berezovsky would be appointed to a key government post, Deputy Secretary of the Security Council. The disintegration of Russia allowed Berezovsky a unique chance to realize his designs on a grand scale. And as he grew stronger, Russia grew weaker. Incredible as it may seem, the foundations of the country's economic and demographic decline were laid by the young reformers and Democrats, led by Yegor Gaidar and Anatoly Chubai. First, in 1992, the Democrats freed prices and unleashed hyperinflation before they privatized Russia's assets. In just a few weeks the savings of the vast majority of the population were wiped out, instantly destroying the hope of building the new Russia on the foundation of a strong domestic market. Second, the Democrats subsidized the traders' well-connected young men who made fortunes by assuming the role of the old state trading monopolies and arbitraging the vast difference between old domestic prices for Russian commodities and the prices prevailing on the world market. Third, Chubai's voucher privatization in 1993–94, following the hyperinflation that had destroyed the Russian savings, was mismanaged. Most Russians simply sold their vouchers for a few dollars to securities traders or unwittingly invested them in pyramid schemes that later collapsed. Instead of creating a broad class of shareholders, Chubai's privatization gave away Russia's industrial assets to corrupt enterprise managers or to the new Moscow banks. Fourth, Chubai and his allies subsidized these new banks by providing them with central bank loans at negative real interest rates, handing them the accounts of government institutions, and rigging the government securities market in their favor. Finally, in the rigged loans for shares auctions of 1995–97, Chubai sold the remaining jewels of Russian industry to a handful of insiders at nominal prices. The crony capitalism that emerged under Yeltsin was not an accident. The government deliberately enriched Berezovsky and a handful of men in return for their political support. Both the Yeltsin clan and the crony capitalists remained in power, but they presided over a bankrupt state and an impoverished population. The young 6. Godfather of the Kremlin. Democrats were supposed to clean up Russia, devise a proper legal system, and foster a market economy. Instead, they presided over one of the most corrupt regimes in history. No one benefited from the arrangement more than Berezovsky. He loved to boast of his accomplishments. He once told the Financial Times that he and 6 other financiers controlled 50% of the Russian economy and had arranged Yeltsin's re-election in 1996.6. Godfather of the Kremlin is not a biography of Boris Berezovsky. It is not a book about his childhood, upbringing, outlook, or personal life. Neither is it a work of political analysis or a consideration of Russia's changing role in the world. It is an investigation into Berezovsky's business and political career. This book charts 2 parallel developments: Berezovsky's rise and Russia's decline. It is also a story of the abuse of Western democratic principles, personal liberty, free speech, electoral government, protection of minority rights, market economics, self-reliance, and the opportunity to make an honest living. In the early 1990s, foreign well-wishers thought that by dismantling communism and enshrining these principles, Russians would transform their country into a Western-style democracy. Billions of dollars of aid and enormous amounts of time were spent to help the transition. If it is hard for Westerners to understand how the introduction of democratic principles could have been so poisonous to Russian society, Berezovsky's career holds one of the keys.
Not include such internationally known figures as Boris Yeltsin or Mikhail Gorbachev. Neither does it include lesser figures whose status or role is made clear at each mention. Roman Abramovich, Berezovsky's partner in the oil business and part owner of the oil company Sibneft. Vagit Perov, Deputy Minister of Fuel and Energy in the last Soviet government, later boss of Russia's largest oil company, Lukoil. Pyotr Avin, Minister of Foreign Trade, 1991-92, President of Alpha Bank, 1992-2000, a friend of Berezovsky's. General Mikhail Barsukov, Chief of the Main Security Administration, 1992-95, Head of the FSB, 1995-96. Shamil Basayev, a Chechen warlord and terrorist commander. Boris Berezovsky, a businessman. General Philip Bobkov, first deputy chairman of the KGB until 1991, thereafter, one of the directors of the security service of Vladimir Gasinski's Most Group. Oleg Boyko, founder of Nationally Credit Bank and the trading company Albi, a business partner of Berezovsky's. Pavel Borodin, head of property management in the presidential administration under Yeltsin, currently under investigation in Switzerland and Russia for bribery and money laundering. Konstantin Borovoy, chairman of the Commodities and Raw Material Exchange, later a member of parliament, 8 Godfather of the Kremlin. Viktor Chernomyrdin, boss of the natural gas monopoly Gazprom. Until 1992, Prime Minister of Russia, 1992-98. Anatoly Chubais, Chief of the Young Reformers, First Deputy Prime Minister in Yeltsin's government, manager of Yeltsin's election campaign in 1996, architect of Russia's privatization campaign, 1991-97. Yves Quendet, a managing director of the Swiss commodities trading company André C. Oleg Davidov, Minister of Foreign Trade, 1994-97. Leonid Dyachenko, Yeltsin's son-in-law, a commodities trader doing business with Berezovsky's oil company, Sibneft. Tanya Dyachenko, Yeltsin's youngest daughter. William Ferrero, General Director of Berezovsky's Swiss financial company Ondava S.A. Yegor Gaidar, the first of the Young Reformers, acting Prime Minister, 1991-92, architect of the 1992 price reform and economic shock therapy. Nikolai Glushkov, a founding member of Berezovsky's holding company Logavaz, head of finance and foreign relations for the automaker Avtovaz, 1989-95, Deputy General Director of the National Airline, Aeroflot, 1995-97. Vladimir Gusinsky, founder of Most Bank and NTV, Berezovsky's arch-rival, 1993-96, his ally, 1996-97, then his rival again, 1998-2000. Alexei Lyushenko, acting Prosecutor General, 1994-95, fired in 1995. In connection with the Balkar trading scandal and the privatization of Sibneft. Vladimir Kadanikov, chairman of Avtovaz, Russia's largest auto manufacturer, a founding member of Berezovsky's Logavaz. General Oleg Kalugin, former head of foreign intelligence, first chief directorate of the KGB. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, former Communist Youth League activist. Founder of Menatep Bank, chairman of the oil company Yukos, a business partner of Berezovsky's. Sergei Kirienko, Minister of Fuel Energy, 1997-98, Prime Minister. 1998. Cast O/characters 9. Alfred Koch, one of the Young Reformers, first Deputy Chairman of the State Property Committee, responsible for privatization. 1995-96, Deputy Prime Minister, 1997. General Alexander Korzakov, Yeltsin's bodyguard, 1987-91, Chief of the Presidential Security Service, 1991-96, Member of Parliament. Since 1997, General Alexander Lebed, Paratroop Commander, Presidential Candidate, 1996, Head of the Security Council 1996. Sergei Lisovsky, Entertainment and Advertising Magnate, Head of Advertising at ORT, one of the coordinators of Yeltsin's 1996 election. Compo 1GN. Vladislav Listayev, Russia's most successful TV producer and talk show host, General Director of ORT, assassinated in 1995. Yuri Lushkov, Mayor of Moscow since 1992. Christian Marat, Head of Russian Operations for the Swiss commodity ties firm Andrei C. Asian Maskadov, President of Chechnya since 1997. Alain Mayer, Head of Russian Operations for the Finco Department of Andrei C., the primary intermediary between the Swiss company and Berezovsky, since 1997, a director of Berezovsky's Swiss financial companies Porus and Ondava. Boris Nemtsov, one of the Young Reformers, first Deputy Prime Minister, 1997-98. Valery Okolov, Yeltsin's son-in-law, General Director of Aeroflot. Since 1997. Badri Paterkatsishvili, a founding member of Logavaz, member of the Board of Directors of ORT and Sibneft, intermediary in Chechen hostage negotiations 1999, suspected of links with organized crime. Vladimir Potanin, founder of Onexim Bank and MFK, controlling shareholder of the oil company Sidanko, Norilsk Nickel, and the telecommunications giant Sfuzinvest, inventor of the loans for shares auctions. Since 1997, a rival of Berezovsky's. Yevgeny Primakov, head of Foreign Intelligence, 1991-96, Foreign Minister, 1996-98, Prime Minister, 1998-99. General Vladimir Rushailo, head of the Moscow ROAP, Police Organized Crime Squad, 1993-96, Minister of Internal Affairs since 1999, Yuri Skuratov, Prosecutor General, 1995-2000. Alexander Smolensky, founder of Stolichny Bank, later renamed SBS Agro, a DOS business partner of Berezovsky's. Oleg Soskovitz, first Deputy Prime Minister until 1996, a political patron of Berezovsky's. Colonel Valery Streletsky, Moscow police veteran, head of Department P, Anti-Corruption, of the Presidential Security Service, 1994-96. Muvlady Udagov, first Deputy Prime Minister of Chechnya since 1996, leader of the extremist wing of the Chechen government, Berezovsky's primary negotiating partner, Gregory Yavlinsky, one of the authors of Gorbachev's 500-day plan of economic reform. The Great Mob War. The shootout at the Kazakhstan cinema. The funeral took place on Saturday at noon. It was a typical July day in Moscow: high clouds, noisy traffic, a yellow haze of smog and dust shrouding the city. At the Church of the Archangel Michael on Vernadsky Prospect, the cars began to pull up, parking on the sidewalks and on the grass. Not just the ubiquitous Russian sedans, but also sleek BMWs, Mercedeses, and Volvos. The mourners entering the church in groups of 3 or 4 were big guys dressed in black jackets, unbuttoned casual shirts, tracksuits. They had come to pay their respects to Igor Ovchinnikov, a former wrestler who had served as the treasurer and chief lieutenant of a large Moscow crime family that, according to Moscow police, was allied to a powerful organization called the Sant-Sevo Brotherhood. Inside the church, the mourners filed by the open coffin and gave a respectful nod to Ovchinnikov's boss, nicknamed Cyclops, a former boxer whose nom de guerre referred to an eye he had lost in a butted with some Chechen gangsters several years before. 1. Ovchinnikov had been killed in a gun butted with a Chechen gang outside the auto showroom of Boris Berezovsky, a 47-year-old man who had spent most of his professional life designing computer software. Berezovsky was hardly the type one would expect to 1112 Godfather of the Kremlin succeed in the world of gangsters, yet in just 4 years, he had laid an obscure joint venture into a major fortune in the car dealer ship business, one of the most criminalized segments of the Russian economy. According to Russian law enforcement officials, Berezovsky had built his dealership, Logoviz, in conjunction with organized crime groups from the southern Republic of Chechnya. He had used the fearsome Chechens for protection. They were his krisha, his roof in the auto market. Berezovsky's fortune made him a target for organized crime groups. He would not survive in this business unless he could protect his gains physically. With the Russian government in disarray, the most effective security services available to business men was the mob. 2. In July 1993, Ovchinnikov's gang began to move on to Berezovsky's turf. One Moscow police detective, charged with tracking Ovchinnikov's movements, described the negotiations as follows. When Ovchinnikov's men approached Logoviz about a partnership, Berezovsky said that he already had a roof and that they should speak to the Chechens. The decisive conversation occurred Side the Logov's showroom in the Kazakhstan Cinema on Lenin Prospect. Ovchinnikov and his gang pulled up in 3 cars and began shooting. The Logov's men shot back. Within minutes 3 men were dead, including Ovchinnikov, and 6 had been wounded. It was one of the bloodiest gang battles in Moscow in 1993.3. When I asked General Vladimir Rushylo, head of the Moscow RUOP, the organized crime squad of the police, about the incident, he replied obliquely, "Many believe that businessmen get killed simply because they are businessmen," he said. Not so. Investigations of cases involving contract killings have shown that the victims were involved in some sort of unclear relationship, to put it diplomatically, with the very people who either ordered or carried out the hits against them. No one kills the law-abiding citizens. Those who do not violate the law, who pay their taxes. The cause of the shootout was that the business you and I were discussing, Logov's, had its own security service, and another gang arrived and wanted to collect money from them as well. The result was entirely predictable. For the Great Mob War 13. Berezovsky told me that he remembered the shootout, but did not know what it was about. He went on to say, "Today we are witnessing a redistribution of property on a scale unprecedented in his Tory. No one is satisfied, neither those who became millionaires overnight. They complain they didn't earn enough millions, nor those who received nothing and are naturally discontented. Therefore, I do not think the extent of crime exceeds the scale of the transformation process." 5. The Chechens. The Chechen gangsters had arrived in Moscow in the late 1980s. Suddenly, restaurants, hotels, banks, and new private businesses, cooperatives, became victims of Chechen extortionists. If they were lucky, recalcitrant managers received a warning. The second time they resisted, they were murdered. Established Moscow criminal gangs, many of their leaders still in prison in the late 1980s, were summarily pushed aside. The Chechens terrorized their competitors. Their thirst for vengeance was frightening, their brutality awesome. Moscow was so traumatized that many unexplained crimes were blamed on the Chechens. The names of Chechen gang leaders: Ruslan at Longeriev, Koza Nukayev, Lechi the Bearded One, Lechi the Bald. The Talarov brothers, Sultan Dadov, Koza Suleimanov, were mentioned with dread in the Moscow underworld. Less well known were the names of future Chechen terrorist commanders, such as Shamil Basayev, who were earning money as businessmen in Moscow in those years. The number of Chechen bandits in Moscow was, even by generous estimates, less than 1,000 men. Yet, in just a few years, they succeeded in taking the Russian capital by storm. 6. No one seemed to know how the Chechen commune worked, or how one Chechen gangster related to another. Russians knew the Chechens mostly from historical lore as a mountain people, renowned for their blood feuds, their celebration of banditry, and their fierce fighting spirit. One of the strengths of the Chechen community in Moscow was its clannishness, no matter how fierce their Kremlin internal blood feuds. Their quarrels never went beyond the commune. Moscow police officers admitted that they could not handle them. Whenever the police closed in on a particular Chechen crime boss, he quickly fled to Chechnya. Nominally part of the Russian Federation, the Republic of Chechnya had long been striving toward independence. The Yeltsin administration offered little resistance. In fact, it left a large arms depot in place for the local Chechen government when Russian troops withdrew in 1991. For the first 3 years of the Yeltsin era, Chechnya existed in a legal gray zone. Since it was still part of Russia, it benefited from Russian government subsidies and from partage a patient in the Russian financial system. At the same time, it was beyond the reach of Russian customs control and law enforcement. One of the Chechen government's first moves after the fall of the Soviet Union was to open the doors of the prisons, releasing an estimated 4,000 professional criminals. Many of the gangster bosses became part of the Chechen government, while maintaining contact with Chechen groups in Moscow and other Russian cities. A good part of the money these groups earned from their rackets was sent back to Chechnya. Grozny Airport became a transshipment point for smuggling operations. Chechnya emerged as a hub of the international heroin trade. One smuggling route began in the Golden Triangle, Burma, Thailand, and Laos. The opium and heroin were transported to the Russian naval base at Cam Ranh Bay, where it was handled by Vietnamese drug traders, then shipped to the Far East port of Nakhatka, where it was handled by Chechen and Russian gangs, flown to Grozny, and then distributed, via Russia, Ukraine, and Turkey, to markets in Europe and the United States. Another smuggling route originated in the Golden Crescent, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. In this case the narcotics passed through the Central Asian republics or Iran and Azerbaijan, before reaching Chechnya, and were then shipped to markets in the West. If the drugs were shipped through Russia, their destination was usually Germany. The contraband was shipped on military transports to Russian army bases in East Germany and then sold to local drug gangs. 7 The Great Mob War 15. In Moscow, the Chechen gangsters quickly took control of the state-owned chain of Berezovsky stores, Soviet-era luxury supermarkets, that catered to foreigners and the Soviet elite. Next, they set up tie-in rackets to cover shops, restaurants, and other businesses around the city. They moved into the wholesale trade when a particularly powerful band of Chechens, led by Koza Suleimanov, took control of the southern port, Moscow's most important river terminal and a big open-air market for automobiles, auto parts, and other big-ticket consumer items. This allowed the Chechens to establish themselves in one of the most important cash businesses in Russia, sales of automobiles, both new and used. They also took over dealerships and repair shops, especially those specializing in foreign cars. Another Chechen gang pushed the Azerbaijani gangsters out of the burgeoning drug trade. 8. When casinos began appearing in 1992-93, the Chechens quickly took control of many of the best ones. Hotels were also a prime target. The gangster takeover of a hotel usually followed the same pattern: first, control the hotel's prostitution racket, then its shops and restaurants, and, finally, the cash flow of the hotel itself. Subsequently, the Chechens moved into the financial markets, taking dozens of banks under their control. 9. The 7 main Chechen gangs in Moscow, Central, Belgrade, Ukraina, Lazania, Ostankino, Salute, and the southern port, fielded a force of approximately 500 fighters in the early 1990s. Many fighters of the Central Group, under the command of Lechi the Bearded One, lived at the giant Rossiya Hotel, across from the Kremlin. From this Chechen-controlled hotel, every destination in the center of Moscow was within easy striking distance. Once there, business empire became too large to manage directly. The Chechens began operating through proxies, enlisting gangsters from Georgia, Dagestan, Ingushetia, and Russia itself. 10. Thieves professing the code. As Chechen gangsters moved into Moscow and other Russian cities, they were not entering virgin territory. The criminal world of the 16 Godfather of the Kremlin Soviet Union had old traditions, developed over decades in the ons and gulags. In the slang of the penal colonies, the code of laws earning the professional criminals was known as the thieves' world. Vorovsky Mir. The chief of the traditional criminal underworld was a person called the thief professing the code, Vorvy Zakon, the closest Russian equivalent to the Godfather of the Sicilian and American mafia. He was typically a hardened criminal, crowned by other thieves professing the code while in prison. One of his duties was to mediate between competing gangs. There were several hundred thieves professing the code in the former Soviet Union. Most were members of one of Russia's ethnic minorities. Out of the 60 or so thieves professing the code in Moscow in 1993, for instance, more than half were from the Republic of Georgia, a country which in Soviet times was famous for its people's penchant for good living and black market trading. Another dozen came from neighboring countries in the Caucasus Mountains. 11. Berezovsky's primary emissary to the traditional underworld was his partner Bodry Paterkatsishvili, one of the co-founders of Logovis. Whenever Berezovsky's business career led him into particularly violent terrain, he would turn to his partner to sort things out. Bodry was a Georgian and had good ties with many important His partner Bodry Paterkatsishvili, one of the co-founders of Logovis. Whenever Berezovsky's business career led him into particularly violent terrain, he would turn to his partner to sort things out. Bodry was a Georgian and had good ties with many important Georgians in Moscow. According to the Presidential Security Service, the FSB, KGB, and at least one major private security agency, Bodry also had close contacts with organized crime groups from the Caucasus. 12. The official position of Bodry at that time, 1993-94, was deputy chairman of the board of directors of Logovis, recalls Gen. Errol Alexander Korzakov, former head of the Presidential Security Service. In fact, his responsibility was to ensure the repayment of debts and to provide protection against gangsters. In Soviet times, Bodry Paterkatsishvili was one of the directors of an auto repair network in Georgia. One of his brothers, Murab, is a thief professing the code. Another brother, Levon, is an authority of a Georgian organized crime group. Bodry also has an alias, like any gangster. In the criminal underworld he is known as Badar. 13. In the 1970s, the most notorious thief professing the code was the Great Mob or 17. Russian ex-convict named Vyacheslav Ivankov, also known as the Jap, Yaponchik. Having been crowned as a thief professing the code during a brief stay in prison in the early 1970s, the Jap developed an extensive operation extorting money from black market entrepreneurs and corrupt officials. He also smuggled narcotics, jewelry, icons, and antiques. He had a reputation for flamboyant brutality, often taking recalcitrant black marketeers into the woods outside town and torturing them. According to one legend, when the Jap was crossed by a Moscow restaurant manager, he had the man buried alive and a road paved over him. Killing someone is as easy as lighting up a cigarette, he apparently liked to say. From Riga to Sverdlovsk, from Kazan to Moscow, he left a trail of fear. Yet, despite his loud criminal career, the Jap did only 2 short stints in prison, one for carrying false documents and one for carrying a gun. Only in 1981 did a combined KGB-MVD operation succeed in netting him. He was convicted of banditry and sentenced to 14 years in prison. 14. The mafia chief had friends in high places. In November 1991, as the Soviet Union was falling apart, the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation freed the Jap, officially because of his bad health. Among those who allegedly petitioned for his release were the Mouse nightclub singer Yosef Kobzon, the world-renowned Isur, Gian Sviatoslav Fyodorov, and the venerable campaigner for human rights, and old colleague of Andrei Sakharov's, Sergei Kovalyev. 15. The Jap's wife came and petitioned me, Fyodorov recalled. Laconically. The Jap was in bad health, and an extra 4 years in prison wouldn't do him any good. Fyodorov perhaps had weightier reasons for dabbling in such affairs. In addition to his famous hospital in Moscow and the clinics he had opened abroad, he also had equity stakes in 2 big Moscow hotels and the Casino Royale, a rival of the Chechen-controlled Cherry Casino. One theory about the Jap's premature release was that Russian law enforcement authorities, including the former KGB, were anxious to produce a counterweight to the Chechen gang's dominant in Russian streets. In 1991-1618, Godfather of the Kremlin, the Jap did not remain in Russia for long. In 1992 he went to New York to establish a criminal network there, preying on the burgeoning Russian émigré community. But he retained strong links with the gangsters back home, mostly through the international narcotics trade. 17. One of the custodians of the Japs' interests in Russia was Ottari Kuntrashvili, Odorik. This dark, bear-like man was not a thief. Professing the code, he was what the police termed an authority in the underworld. The Jap is one of the most honest people around, Odorik gushed to me in 1993. Even if he was a criminal, he was only a private criminal. And private criminals today are nothing in comparison with the state criminals who have bankrupted Russia and are buying themselves homes in Florida. As a young man, Odorik had been a talented wrestler, with a good shot at making the Olympic TP.M. But in 1966, when he was 18 years old, he participated in a gang rape. He was treated leniently by the authorities. After 4 years in prison, he was diagnosed as a schizophrenic, transferred to a psychiatric hospital, and freed soon after. In the early 1980s, he got a job as a wrestling coach for the prestigious Dynamo Sports Complex in Moscow. He trained many of the boxers, wrestlers, martial arts specialists, and weightlifters who would later join the various crime gangs of Moscow. By the early 1990s, he had become a highly visible entrepreneur and philanthropist. His official position was chairman of the Lev Yushin Charitable Foundation for the social rehabilitation of athletes. Funded largely by lucrative customs tax exemptions, this foundation was a job placement program for Russian athletes. Odorik claimed that he channeled his athletes into clean professions. "I do not let my lads go out and start robbing and killing people," he declared. His office was a row of suites on the top floor of the Intourist Hotel, where the KGB used to have its offices. I managed to speak to him in August 1993. He was remarkably candid about his gangster connections. "I do not pay money to any mafia organizations," he said. "On the contrary, they give me money.